Chicago Bulls fans, welcome to the channel. This video was heavily requested from many of the viewers, so shout out to them. You'll see some of those comments flashing on the screen now. And just like you clicked on, this video is a Chicago Bulls offseason preview where we're going to take a deep look and kind of give out a guide for what this team could potentially look to do, some of their potential pathways and options. Of course, it's possible that they could explore some things that are not listed in this video. But for the most part, I feel like I typically lay out pretty well thought out and pretty articulated analysis on what these teams could potentially look to do. And I think the Bulls are at a very interesting spot. They're one of the reasons I saved this team as the only non-playoff team yet to be recorded on the channel up to this point. Because I thought I need the most time to think about this team and to kind of plan out what their offseason could look like and really map out this team's future. Because I think it's a difficult challenge to really look at and see what this team could do. If you would like to see a different team's offseason preview, leave a comment down in the comment section below, and also make sure to subscribe to Utility Sports, leave a like on today's video, do all that good stuff that helps me out here on the channel, lets me know I'm doing a good job. So without further ado, let's jump into that video preview where we're going to look at, first of all, a season recap for this team, how their year went, things that went right, things that went wrong, and everything else in between, because it's important to know where this team was to figure out where we're going to get them to go to next, which the very next step is that 2023 NBA draft lottery, which comes up May 16th. We are 10 days away at the time I'm recording this, so I am so stoked and really just excited for the NBA draft lottery in general. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. Just seeing what teams potentially move up, move down, that kind of thing really sets the order. Then we'll see NBA free agency. We'll look at what they could do in that regard. Of course, the Bulls, I think, have some potential challenges ahead of them when it comes to cap space, pending free agents. We'll talk about all of that. And then some targets as well. Guys that I think we could see them look to make moves for in free agency. And then also afterward, we're going to consider some offseason trade discussions, and I don't really necessarily have those targets specifically on guys that I pinpointed and said Chicago needs to go out and get this dude, but I have kind of a generic trade opinion on what I think this team should do and what they're best positioned to do this offseason when it comes to making trades if they choose to make a decision that I think I would make in their spot. Then we'll look at the early outlook. Where is this team going to go next, and what I really think about this squad going into not only just this next season, but also the long-term future starting from this spot forward. And to be honest, I wish I could give a more glowing analysis on this team and say, oh, I think they're really set long-term. I think there's some big questions. So that's going to be a very interesting segment in this video. Hopefully you stick around until we get to that spot of the video. So here we are now with that season recap. This team went 40-42, lost in the play-in, did not make the NBA playoffs, of course. Patrick Beverley looked like he was going to be playoff Pat or play-in Pat once again. Unfortunately, did not pan out that way, and they got bounced one game away from making the NBA postseason. And of course, you look at what happened to the eventual one seed Milwaukee Bucks. Well, maybe the Bulls, if they got in, could have played a little bit of upset, right? Probably not. I was not very high on this team coming into the season. I think there are some inherent flaws, even though there are a lot of good players individually. I think one of those, and in my opinion, the best player on the team, DeMar DeRozan, still has a real role in this league, and somebody that I think a lot of teams should have had interest in back when the Bulls signed him in free agency. I talked about that quite a bit, and I said that free agency period, the Bulls got a lot of really good players. They did. They made some serious noise that offseason. And DeMar DeRozan, of course, has made an All-NBA selection since then. He's consistently put up 20-plus points a game. Of course, a year ago, he was so fantastic in the fourth quarter. It's funny, the Bulls actually started this season off pretty poorly in the fourth quarter. Their clutch time ratings were all pretty terrible. As the season progressed, those things started to correct themselves because crunch time and clutch time in the NBA is really hit or miss sometimes. You can't really just bank on it from year to year. Even though you associate clutch as a trait with a lot of guys, it just doesn't really carry out that way season to season the way that you would expect it to, because it's a make or miss league. The nice thing is, though, DeRozan, whenever he's shooting a two-point shot, it feels like it's only a make league for him because he just does not miss seemingly, especially when he's on a real burner. It just seems like nobody can stop him, which is why, in my opinion, he's the best player on the team. The other guy who would be in consideration for that is, of course, Zach LaVine. And I do want to say one thing. The way that Chicago, obviously trading Jimmy Butler, tough decision. And you could say, well, That's a big mistake. You look at the team that traded for Jimmy Butler in Minnesota, and it's just they give up Levine, the rights to Lauri Markkanen, and just everything that could have went wrong really did, other than Chris Dunn never really figuring it out in Chicago. But realistically, Levine has been a nice asset for them, a player that they've enjoyed having there. Of course, you think back to the offer sheet he signed with Sacramento years ago, and how I think that was a really tough decision at the time for Chicago, whether to match that or not. They ultimately chose to. And since then, they've given him a nice big contract. We'll talk about how that's going to affect them long-term later on in this video. But Levine and DeRozan are really the two poster boys for what this team's supposed to be, in terms of you have two guys who can score off the wings and really just play off of each other in a variety of ways, of course. DeRozan more of like a downhill and get to your spot and rise up, whereas Levine more of a perimeter shot maker. Of course, the high-end athleticism that we know him for doesn't really show itself as frequently with some of the knee injuries he's had. I wouldn't say he's lost like bounce or a step, which, well, maybe I would say that, but it's just he's less willing to play in that style, which also makes sense given the injury history, that he's kind of toned down his game a little bit. And he's a very skilled player, very similar to DeRozan, honestly, in some of the ways that he's just like a natural, gifted, tough bucket getter. But it's still, when you have two guys like that you're going to rely on, if they're not the top of the world type players, it's going to be really tough to win NBA games. I think we've seen that from time to time for Chicago. Nikola Vucevic played 82 games this season. Big credit to him for that. He was able to stay on the floor. Of course, didn't play very much in game 82, but he played. So he made it to all 82 games, and I think for the most part had a fairly productive season for himself. Now, if you're going to ask me, do I think that trading for him was worth it? My obvious answer is no. And would they make that trade again? With the hindsight, definitely not. They would not. Look, Vucevic has been good. I think when they traded for him, they were hoping he would be great. And you just can't really afford to have a center that you're going to try and like give offensive touches to and just not get him to be like the, great player he was in Orlando at moments. I think the inconsistency a little bit with him on that end of the floor is just left Chicago in a tough spot, where I'd say like they've got a lot of good players. I just don't know if they have like that one high-end superstar. And I don't want that to be the focus of this video. I really don't. But it is a serious flaw with their roster. And then also Patrick Williams played 82 games. Had a nice productive season for himself in terms of points per game at over 10 points a game. Shot fairly well from the field, both inside the arc and outside of it, with I believe 42 to 43% three-point percentage this season. So very prolific shooting splits. But we're still kind of waiting for that big step. A lot of people labeled Patrick Williams as the next Kawhi Leonard, things like that. I never really bought that hype. I was actually pretty surprised when they drafted him 4th overall. I liked his tape from college. I didn't love it. And I just feel like I have to keep saying that about this Bulls team, is there's a lot of guys I like or really like or kind of like. There's not a lot of guys I'm like, wow, I would love to have that player on my team. I think DeRozan's really the only one that I'm like, I would need him. I would also love to have Alex Caruso, which we'll talk about here in a second, but there are some flaws with that too. I would assume I know is a Bulls fan favorite, and should be. He's a very good young player in this league. Of course, got a lot of love from his time at Illinois. And I think he's proven that in his time in the league, he's going to be a reliable guard. He played around 80 games this season, and somebody that off the bench makes a lot of sense for you. And I think he's just carved out a long career already for himself, just based off of name recognition. I mean, we've seen Frank Ntilikina basically at this point have like a 7-year career. So there's no reason why I would assume he was not going to have like a 10 to 12-year career. He's just a good player who's going to stick in this league for a while. There's a lot of nice stuff downhill. Obviously quick. That was one of the big things about him coming out of Illinois, is he has downhill quickness and can really put some pressure on the rim as a slasher, and then obviously has the skill set to kick out of that, which I think has been a nice tool for Chicago this year and last year as well, I should mention, and kind of gives them some nice pace for this team. Alex Caruso, I really like Alex Caruso, but it is kind of concerning to me that he shot the second least amount of shots per game in his career outside of his rookie season. And honestly, Caruso just deciding to not really shoot as much anymore is kind of surprising to me. It's down like, I believe, 3 shots a game from his highest field goal attempts per game in his career. And to be honest, you watch the games and you say, Oh, is Alex Caruso even out there some of the time, especially on the offensive end of the court? Because, like, I know he's got the connector skill set and he, makes timely passes. He's a smart player. I think he's a really good player to have on the team. But, like, you can't be playing like Jordan McLaughlin out there where you're going to slash and look to get to the paint just to kick the ball out. You need to be a threat to score. The NBA is about scoring and putting points on the board. And Caruso, surprisingly, he's kind of taken a step back since landing in Chicago, which is one of the issues with the team overall. Actually, you look at the team on paper, you think, okay, DeRozan, LaVine, Vucevic, Patrick Williams, we're going to have a good offensive team is kind of what you would assume. But actually, it's been the opposite, especially this past season. Defensively, they were actually very good. Top 5 in opponents' points per game, which I mean that in a good way, not like fifth fewest allowed, which is very impressive because, again, you look at up and down the roster, you're not really expecting that. Maybe you give some props to a guy like Patrick Williams there, which is, one of the areas I do think he's impactful. I think also Javonte Green, when he's out on the court, is good in that regard. Getting Patrick Beverley and having Alex Caruso, those two guys also help impact that. So they do have some good defensive individual players, but you would just think naturally with, Vucevic as your center, you're going to have some questions about rim defense and that kind of thing. They were really, really good defensively. They just didn't really score the ball. They ranked just inside the top 20 when it comes to scoring the basketball, which is a surprise. Again, you look at the roster and you would think this team's going to be way more prolific than they are. They just weren't. So that's one of the big concerns for me moving forward is how do they look to score the ball more? And I think a part of that too, when you look at points per game and offensive rating, defensive rating, it's not just that they play slow. The pace obviously does help them in a few different ways, which we're going to talk about here too. Like points per game, obviously pace really affects that. It doesn't really affect offensive and defensive rating as much as you would expect, but at the same time, it does have impact, and I'm going to explain why here. You think about a team like Sacramento or Golden State, two of the most prolific offenses in the league. A lot of their looks come in early transition where they're playing against, 4-on-4 or 3-on-3 looks or 4-on-3, 5-on-4. Those kinds of settings allow you to play an advantage and score the ball just a little bit more frequently. Yes, you get way more shots up, so you're naturally going to score more points per game, but your offensive rating is also going to be higher because you're also probably generating some more clean looks. And comparatively to a team like the Dallas Mavericks, where Luka Doncic slows everything down, the team plays kind of at a standstill. The Mavericks have typically struggled offensively with Luka Doncic running the show just because of the pace of play. And I think that Chicago has that element to why their offense is naturally worse. But at the same time, their defense is significantly better because they are playing slower, slowing the game down to a certain extent. They ranked 19th in pace of play this year, which isn't like standstill slow, but it's still relatively slow. And it makes sense given the age on this roster. You think about DeRozan, Vucevic, both well into their 30s as two of your main guys when it comes to actual minutes per game. Like, you're going to naturally play a little bit slower with older players. But I think that that's not really the way that they wanted to play. You flash back to a year and a half ago, early in the season when they kind of started out super hot with Lonzo Ball in there and Caruso, DeRozan, LaVine. It just felt like they were always flying around. They had so much athleticism. That team could get up and down the court so quickly. And I think really, when we talk about the missing piece or pieces, I think the real missing piece is Lonzo Ball. I think his absence from this team is just a night and day difference. I don't think that the Bulls are like a 60-win team with Lonzo, but I think they're probably like a 48-win team, 47-win team. And you might say, really, you think Lonzo's a 7 or 8 win improvement? I really do, because I think his style not only opens the floor up so much more for DeRozan and LaVine when it comes to finding their shots inside the arc and sometimes outside of it, because Lonzo's really grown into a fantastic outside perimeter shooter, but also his offensive connectivity. He's one of the best breakout passers in the league. He's really, really good with the live handle in transition. I think he's probably one of the better transition passers in today's game just in general. And I think that some of those elements that he brought to the team and his ability to push the ball in transition and really increase the tempo of a game at the right times to do so really helped Chicago kind of look like a better offense than maybe a lot of people expected them to be, especially last year when, before Lonzo and Caruso both went down near the same timeline, the Bulls were first in the Eastern Conference. And I'm not saying that they could have kept that pace and would have maintained that pace into this year, but it definitely doesn't help having Lonzo out and Caruso shooting less. and playing a much slower game. It's just, I think that their style that they were hoping for, that the management and front office was hoping for, hasn't been perfectly played out because some of those young guys that were meant to be supports in terms of the athleticism and pushing the pace and doing some of those things have been out of the lineup, which has limited what this Bulls team has been. And they've been a little bit more reliant on some of those older guys in Vucevic and DeRozan than I think that they initially wanted to be. Now, I think that you bring those guys in because you're planning on having them and utilizing them heavily. But now when you're missing key guys, the fourth, fifth best players on your roster, you go down the totem pole and you say, okay, well, we need this guy to step up a little bit more. We need one of our top dogs to play more. Levine's also missed some time, of course, been dealing with some injuries over the last couple of years. So it's just, there's been a lot asked of Vucevic and DeRozan. I just think that that's not going to get the job done in today's NBA. It's just not, with how much talent there is. I think the league really needs some expansion, which we're going to have a video on at some point on the channel. Like, really, it's a tough situation. I think Chicago's kind of at a tough spot in their current retooling that Arturas Karnisovas really spearheaded and made a lot of aggressive moves. I think the logic was there. I think it was well thought out, well planned, but sometimes bad injury luck, especially in the case of Lonzo Ball, where it's no clear timetable for him to ever return to playing NBA basketball. That's a serious red flag for not only his career, but also the way that this team was built. And I think Lonzo Ball was one of those key missing puzzle pieces this season. So as we go into our next one here, we look at the NBA draft lottery and some of the things that we need to watch for if you're a Chicago Bulls fan. First of all, you're looking for that 8.5% chance towards the top of the draft. There's an 8.5% chance that Chicago moves up into the top 4 in this year's draft, and it's very important. That is probably the most important thing to watch for in this year's draft, because they have a really important protection to talk about. Top 4 protected pick that they owe to Orlando for the Nikola Vucevic trade. And if it moves up into the top 4, there are plenty of great options that Chicago would like to consider. But you see those red numbers on the right, 77.6, 13.5, 0.4. Those are the red dead numbers, and that's not where you want to be if you're Chicago. Typically, Chicago Reds fared really well for them. You don't want lottery red, because that is a killer, especially for where this franchise currently is. A team that really needs an infusion of youth and good youth, talented youth, in my opinion. There's only an 8.5% chance that they get it. 1.8% chance to land Victor Wembanyama, who I think would really give them a lot of clarity as to how to build this team and really solve a big issue for them that's coming up. A 2% chance to be picking second and land Scoot Henderson, who I think, again, gives you a lot of clarity and says, okay, Lonzo's out. We're going to bank on him being out. It's okay. We now have our point guard of the future in Scoot Henderson. I think he would bring some of that pace and space and be able to push the ball in transition. Some of those things I highlighted about Lonzo. He's not as natural of a connector, but he's a little bit better with the ball in his hands as a primary scorer than what Lonzo Ball would give you. And maybe it gives you some freedom to explore DeRozan or a Levine trade, even if you felt like Scoot Henderson's going to grow into that offensive number 1 scoring type, or even a number 2 scorer, where you can hopefully find a number 1 scorer that fits his timeline a little bit better. It's an option, right? 2.2% chance at Brandon Miller, who I think they would take 3rd overall in this year's draft if they had that pick, assuming that both Victor and Scoot are off the board. And the reason why they take Brandon Miller, I think he's a more clear fit onto this roster. Offensively, gives them a lot more in terms of what they need in terms of perimeter shooting. They didn't even shoot the ball poorly from 3 this past year, around 37% as a team, which is actually kind of right around the middle, which is where you want to be. As long as you're not a terrible shooting team, that's what you're looking for, especially around guys like DeRozan and Levine. But just adding another premier wing who can actually score the basketball, do some stuff with it in his hands off the dribble, and probably would become your bridge player for the future and the guy that you'd look to build around long term. I think that would make a lot of sense for Chicago. And then 4 would be a really interesting spot because Amen Thompson's there. Does Chicago, who is so invested in this current team in DeRozan and Levine, would they look at Amen Thompson and say, okay, it's time to pivot toward the future and maybe move off of some of these guys? Would they try and make Amen Thompson the starting point guard with an aged roster around him? That would be a very unique situation. I would not expect, and I've not been expecting this year, to kind of see Amen Thompson on a team trying to win playoff series, because I just think that those two things kind of do not go hand in hand right now. I think Amen Thompson needs a lot of developmental time, and I think he probably needs to play a season in the league before you can expect him to really highly impact winning, which is okay. There's nothing wrong with that as a prospect. But it would be a puzzling decision by Chicago to draft Amen Thompson and then keep the veterans. Like, I just don't know if those two things really fit together that well. Maybe I could be wrong about that. So would they look at something like a Jarris Walker out of Houston, or maybe a Taylor Hendricks out of UCF? Would they go in a different direction? Maybe an Anthony Black from Arkansas, who I think would be a fantastic fit on this team. But pick number 4 is pretty high to do that. Would they try and trade out of that? Those are some big questions. But remember, at the end of the day, there's like a 91.5% chance that Orlando has this draft pick, which really, like, again, 91.5% of the time, Bulls fans leave the draft lottery extremely sad. They would probably have questions and concerns about their long-term future, especially since they don't have a first-round pick in this year's draft, and it's a loaded draft to have a first-round pick in. So Chicago's in a really tough spot, and I think there's a lot of questions for this team on how they're going to try and get out of it. So when it comes to our next topic of discussion, that is NBA free agency, and they are projected nearly $8 million in cap space. And Bulls fans might be saying, whoa, we're positive in cap space? That's awesome. Not really. $8 million in cap space does you basically no good. In fact, teams that are over the cap have just as much flexibility as you do, basically, because those teams can also offer the non-taxpayer mid-level exception. But the Bulls, I guess there are some moves that they can make to open up space and kind of move some pieces around to go out there and maybe sign a guy or two, but I don't really see that as an extreme likelihood, especially with how many moves they'd have to make. They'd have to really trim down their roster. And some of the guys already out in unrestricted free agency from them this year, pending free agents: Nikola Vucevic, Javonte Green, Patrick Beverley. I think that there's significant interest in keeping some of these players, especially Vucevic, on the right price point. Now, if you're paying him $25 million a year, I think the Bulls are in a lot of trouble long term. We saw a similar situation play out last year with the Portland Trailblazers, where they gave Jusuf Nurkic a big contract, and I just don't think that, as Vucevic is going to turn 33 years old next year, you should be committing to him for anything around 4 years, $75 to $80 million even, and that's significantly less than $25 million a year. If he signs a 4-year, $100 million deal with the Bulls are in NBA purgatory at that point. You can't afford to do that. And if it means you have to let him walk in free agency, as tough as a pill of that is to swallow, you just can't. You can't overpay him at this point of his career. You can't do it. You have to have a firm cutoff point with him. For me, it would be maybe a little bit more than the non-taxpayer mid-level, maybe $15 million. 4 years, 60, I would consider. Now, would I myself personally sign him to that? I would have to do more thinking, but I think that's really the price point that the Bulls should have targeted, of something significantly less than $20 million a year. If you give them that much money, I just don't see a way that this team is going to be able to completely turn this thing around and build for the future while committing to a 33-year-old center, or a nearly 33-year-old center. Javonte Green, nice player. Didn't talk about him very much in the season recap. He's a good defender. We all know what Javonte Green is at this point of his career. It's not going to be much more than that, but you don't need him to be, because there's always a role like that in the NBA for guys who are corner sitters, creative cutters, and defensive-minded guys. Patrick Beverley, I think the Bulls would like to have him back. We'll see if they actually do go in that direction, though. They have some other players that they also like at the guard spot, and that's Coby White, Ayo Dosunmu. Of course, 2 players who are restricted free agents this offseason. And for both of them, there's some questions about, the longevity of them spending their careers in Chicago. I think Ayo Dosunmu is a no-brainer. He'll be back in Chicago. But Coby White, there's, I think, conflicting reports out right now, and you really can't trust any report you hear, especially if you're getting it on Bleacher Report, or, you're seeing some beat writer on Twitter. I'd just say be very careful about it. I know that there's reports saying, oh, the Bulls would love to have Coby White back. I'm sure that they're going to say that, because then it makes it more likely that if he were to sign an offer sheet with another team, that number maybe goes up an extra $2 or $3 million a year than originally expected, which just helps their business by forcing a team to maybe pay a little bit more to get the guy off of their roster. And naturally, the Bulls, I mean, if the price is right for Coby White, they'll match it, but they're not going to sit here and break the bank for Coby White. I'm not going to sit here and lie to you guys and say, I think Coby White's going to get, I don't think he's going to get that big of a bag. Maybe like 4 years 40, 4 years 48 is like kind of the high end of what I see for Coby White. It's funny because Cam Johnson is going to get significantly more than him in free agency this offseason, which is a good flashback to the draft night where both he and Johnson were drafted, and kind of a crazy turn of events there with how everything's going to go between those two guys in free agency. But Coby White, valuable, but you can't overpay him either, which is my opinion. So as we go into potential targets here, there are quite a few players I do like in free agency for this team for a variety of different reasons. First of all, we're going to highlight Derrick Rose. Bulls fans probably smiled ear to ear when they saw this. Derrick Rose, I just, again, am I counting on him to give you 20 minutes a night now? No, this is like a feel good. Let's add him to the roster. I think in spot minutes, he could help this team because remember, they couldn't really score the ball this year. Derrick Rose, I think, can still score the basketball. I think he's an efficient shot creator and somebody who, when you need a tough bucket, I think he can still give it to you as long as you're not riding him for 25 minutes a night or more, because at this point he's got so much wear and tear on his body. You just can't rely on that for an 82-game season every single night. So can you give him a bench role and say, look, some nights he might not play, some nights we might play you 15, 20 minutes. And is he going to accept that? I think at this point he has to, and it's probably going to be near the minimum, if not on the minimum, which is what I would sign him to. And I think that's what Chicago, if they're going to explore some type of reunion, that's what they'd be willing to offer him. And I do think it would be not only good for ticket sales for the organization, I know the fans themselves would love it. Obviously, one of the most historic players in Bulls history, and it's a very long storied franchise, a team that won 6 championships within the last 35 years or so. And it's just, it's awesome to see a potential Derrick Rose reunion, something I would really want to sign up for just to see as an NBA fan. There's a few other options on here too that I really do like though. Brook Lopez, mid-level exception. The Bucks are undergoing some changes. They fire Mike Budenholzer. Brook Lopez heading toward unrestricted free agency, as is potentially Chris Middleton, who's on a player option. I think there's a lot of pressure there for that team to win and win big time in the postseason. And I think Brook Lopez was a significant problem for Milwaukee this postseason playing against the Miami Heat. I think that just his drop coverage style, the only thing that he's really capable of playing at this point of his career, got significantly exposed by Bam Adebayo's dribble handoff capabilities, especially with Duncan Robinson, who had a career series for himself just because he was shooting with so much open space. So you might be saying, well, if Brook Lopez is a significant issue, why would the Bulls look into it? He can provide some really good perimeter spacing, and he still was a defensive player of the year candidate, even though he's 35 years old. And I know people are going to be saying, whoa, you pay Brook Lopez, but not Nikola Vucevic. Yes, they're completely different players. And I think Brook Lopez's value on the defensive end significantly outweighs Vucevic's value on the offensive end. To me, I would prefer having Brook Lopez, especially on this Bulls team. I know that the issue wasn't defense based on what we saw, but I also think a pick and pop big, which is what Vucevic is, but on a cheaper price point and a better defensive player. If you save money making all of those decisions, a guy who shoots just about as well, a guy who protects the rim better, and he's cheaper, it just seems like a no-brainer to me on why the Bulls would consider moving off of Vucevic in favor of Brook Lopez, using their non-taxpayer mid-level exception on something around 3 years, $38 million, somewhere around there, 3 years, 37. Of course, you can work in some of those bonuses along the way on top of that $12.221 million mark. Naz Reid, mid-level exception guy too. Now, he might get higher bids in actual free agency from teams that have significant cap space. There's a lot of teams out there that do. Think about the Spurs, the Jazz, the Thunder, all as potential options. The Houston Rockets, I think, would maybe explore Naz Reid. Not as much now that they hired Ime Udoka, but a lot of these teams are in talent acquisition mode, and Naz Reid, perhaps one of the more talented big men out in the market, because he's got pretty good size to him, but he can also put the ball on the deck. We know he can knock down perimeter jump shots. He's actually a surprisingly good athlete with his ability to not only just jump, but also work through traffic and burst in different ways than you'd expect for a big man. So I think the mid-level may be a little too cheap for him. I've been kind of targeting him as a mid-level plus type player, because if it's the right situation that his agent feels like, hey, you'll get significant playtime, maybe even a starting spot here, Naz Reid, who has not been a long-term starter in his career at any point, maybe would favor that. Of course, in Minnesota's behind Gobert and Karl Anthony Towns at the time I'm recording this. Who knows if a trade's going to go down there? That would open up a spot for Naz Reid in the starting lineup, so they do have bird rights on him. But realistically, like, would he take the mid-level instead of $14 million a year or $15 million a year if it means he's starting? Probably. So I think that's where Chicago would have to do some soul searching and think, does Naz Reid really help us? I think offensively, his downhill ability to actually put the ball on the deck and score in that regard would help them. He had multiple 20-plus point games this season, even off the bench. So I think he could be a nice volume scorer for them, which is something, again, we've highlighted as a need. Omer Yurtseven, Louis King, and Nehemiah Queta, all on here for different reasons, but ultimately the same reason. They're young, talented players. Omer Yurtseven, we've seen him mostly in the Miami Heat Summer League program, but he has played some NBA minutes, and he's been decently productive in them. Now, Miami has gone to a lot of zone looks with him on the court. I do think he's got some flaws in terms of being a high minutes guy, but I think the Bulls are one of the few teams here that it's important to include some restricted free agents, especially restricted free agents on two ways, which I have not yet done in any offseason preview until this one, because I do think that the Bulls need to be a team that is exploring young talent and trying to bring in as much young talent as possible, even if it means giving a guaranteed deal to a guy who's not played significant NBA minutes yet. Queta, Louis King really have not. Louis King played one game this year. Now, he did score 20 points in that one game for Philadelphia. He was a G League MVP, one of the best G League players we've seen in the last 3-4 years. The reason why you go out and sign him, can he become a bench spark plug for you? Does he have a role in this league? And that's where, on the minimum, that's what you're guaranteeing him. Worst case, he ends up being your 13th or 14th guy on the roster and it doesn't hurt you. Best case, maybe he turns into your 9th or 8th guy and gives you some added boost, especially in a department that you need. He's a wing scorer who can put the ball on the deck and get to spots on the floor and score. He's a pretty solid slasher. He's a decent athlete. That's what makes sense. Nehemiah Queta was also a very productive G League player this year for the Stockton Kings. He actually was all G League first team. So very young, big, former second round pick a couple years ago. I think that Sacramento would like to keep him. They do have bird rights on him, but at the same time, there are some questions there because Trey Lyles is also a free agent this offseason. I think just with what Lyles gave Sacramento this year as well, they would like to keep him. Of course, Sabonis kind of has that center position locked down long term. So does Queta just become semi-expendable for Sacramento? And if the answer to that is yes, his shot blocking, his athleticism downhill, his ability to rebound the basketball becomes an obvious fit for the Bulls as a kind of a young big who you're hoping to get into your system. Probably only plays 10 minutes a game the first year he's spending with you, but the hope is kind of by next year or the year after that maybe he becomes an 18 to 25 minute a game guy. And if that's the case, then you absolutely stole him away from a team that probably is just not valuing him as much as they maybe should, which is what I think. I think he could have a nice productive role in this league at some point with the right team. Plus, one more guy that I want to highlight, and that is Russell Westbrook. And I think he should be the no doubt, no-brainer. The Bulls should sign him if they can get him on the non-taxpayer mid-level exception. Is he worth more money? Probably, but to what team? And that's really the big question. I don't see a team lining up to give Russell Westbrook $18 to $25 million this offseason. If the Clippers had early bird rights on him and looked to do that, I think that would make some sense. But realistically, they don't have that pathway. I did a little bit more research on that in one of my videos. I talked about potentially Russell Westbrook sticking with the Clippers on a bigger number. I had that incorrect. So the Bulls, I think, could become potential suitors, and there's a few things that line up very well here. Again, the Bulls need a pace pusher. That's exactly what Russell Westbrook is. For better or for worse, he pushes the pace, and he does it rather decently most of the time. Now, I think that there's moments where the game kind of gets out of control and he doesn't have the best reign as a true point guard on controlling the game and slowing it down when it needs to be slowed down and really understanding clock, score, possession. Those are important things to know as a point guard. So Billy Donovan would have to have a tighter leash on him than we've seen other coaches in the past. And I think the one thing that really benefits the Bulls here in potentially signing Russell Westbrook is Billy Donovan has a long-lasting relationship with Russ. You think back to who coached Russ when he won MVP of the league, who would trust Russell Westbrook, and who would Russell Westbrook trust as a head coach. I think Ty Lue's one of those guys that he would trust, which is why I think the Clippers remain a fit and a potential sticking point for Russ. But at the same time, the Bulls have a head coach in Billy Donovan who I know Russ trusts and would like to play for again. And because of that, I think 3 years, $37 million, it's really not that bad for a guy who, if you watched any of the postseason, especially the first round Clippers versus Suns, I know the Clippers lost in 5 games. Had Kawhi or Paul George been on the floor, I think that they win that series. And I think that they win it fairly comfortably. Russell Westbrook was keeping them in that series even without those guys. I know they didn't win any games when Kawhi Leonard didn't play, this, that, and the other thing. they were competitive games. They weren't getting blown out by 25, 30 points. They were down by 5, down clutch time. I mean, the fact that Russell Westbrook plus a bunch of other role players was down by 5 to Kevin Durant, Devin Booker, some of those other premier players in Phoenix shows that Russell Westbrook still has a lot to give. And I think the Bulls would be smart at least investigating a Russell Westbrook signing and just giving it some really good, strong thought, because the last thing you want to do is just say, no, we're good on talent. The more talent you can accumulate and add, the better, especially when you have question marks about Lonzo Ball's long-term availability. I think Russ becomes a pretty clear fit, not only with the coaching staff, but with the other pieces on this team as well. And if teams are creative, there's a lot of ways you can use Russell Westbrook if he buys into that. We'll see, but ultimately, I think that there's a lot of good that can come from Russ being on a roster, and I think the Bulls are one of the 2 teams I would prefer to see him on next season. So looking at offseason trades, I don't really have any that I canvassed the league. I looked at everything and try matching money on deals, and I couldn't land on anything where I thought, yeah, Chicago should be a buyer right now. I can't say that I feel that way in this video. I would love to say, oh yeah, Chicago's one piece away, this and the other. I just don't believe it. Okay. And I'm not going to blow smoke here. I'm not going to say, oh, this team, if they make one big move, I don't think that they have a real pathway to setting themselves up to win a title. So let's look at it the other way. Do I expect them to blow it up? My answer to that is no. And the reason why is if Arturas Karnisovas blows it up and says, yeah, I was completely wrong and this did not work out well, and oh, by the way, we owe the Magic our first round pick still, ownership has a pretty clear idea of, oh, so all the decisions you said were going to be really good didn't work out. It really does assign the blame. And a lot of GMs, a lot of owners, a lot of people in positions of power do not like to accept that type of blame and say, I was wrong. So do I expect the Bulls to blow it up this season or this offseason? Definitely not. But if they at least explore doing so, which is what I think that they really should, and if they could get their pride and ego out of the way, that's probably what they should do. Zach LaVine has to be the first one out. And I don't have any mock Zach LaVine trades. Maybe I'll have a video out on the channel at some point about a Zach LaVine trade or two. I don't love to, float all these ideas out here, especially when there's not like firm, good reporting behind it. But realistically, he's their best value piece when it comes to how he's going to be perceived around the league. Now, if I was another team for a rival team, if I was a rival executive, I would have zero interest in acquiring Zach LaVine because I think his contract is massive, and I don't think he impacts winning to the level that a player on that type of contract should. So I would instantly cross him off as a player I'm not interested in acquiring unless I was getting incentivized to do so. And I know Bulls fans probably just spit out their water and said, wait, what? Yeah, like, trust me, that's probably not going to happen. That's just, I'm telling you the way I would probably consider a Zach LaVine trade if I was a rival GM. No, I don't think it's going to go about that way. There's plenty of desperate teams all the time. We saw the Dallas Mavericks trade an unprotected first and 2 good players for Kyrie Irving, something I was not expecting to happen. It happens. There's crazy stuff around the league all the time that just makes you spit out your water and makes me spit out my water and say, wait, what is going on right now? So LaVine probably would get traded for some value. And because of that, I do believe he's probably the player with the most perceived value around the league right now on this Bulls roster, just given his age and some of the things he has accomplished as a scorer in this league. So if you are going to blow it up, you trade him first, you then see what you have, and you continue with your other trades. The one thing I think about, the way that Brooklyn went about things, obviously trading Kyrie it's a completely different story, but they went out and got Dorian Finney-Smith and Spencer Dinwiddie with the idea of, oh, these guys fit around Kevin Durant, and then all of a sudden Kevin Durant says, no, I'm out of here too. And then you made a move with your lesser asset to try and set up for your bigger asset, and then your bigger asset said, no, I'm not going to be here. So really, you have to start with your biggest asset first, move that, and then you can move the other assets from there to try and build something, because the other way just doesn't really work, in my opinion. I think it's a lot tougher to go about it that way, because if you move the biggest asset and you don't get the value you needed to get, and you get different value to match other stuff, it's just in a tough spot. So I think that LaVine would be the guy that they'd have to trade first, and I think there would be some interest from some teams around the league. I think the Lakers, the Blazers would have interest. I think the New York Knicks could potentially have interest, although one of the first things Tom Thibodeau did when he got to Minnesota was, first of all, run Zach LaVine's ACL into the ground, and then secondly, trade him. But I still think that in terms of like another half-court scorer, it does make some sense for them, and they have the assets to go unload for a guy like Zach LaVine and still feel comfortable about keeping some of the other assets back and keep them in the wings to make another big move later. So I wouldn't rule out the Knicks completely. And if I'm Chicago, like, I'd just be willing to trade Zach LaVine. I just would be, but we'll see. I don't think that they do, though. So ultimately, I think this is a lot of fluff and no actual movement this offseason for the Chicago Bulls at this point. So when it comes to an early outlook, I feel really bad about what I'm about to say. I wish it wasn't that way because I really do like watching the Chicago Bulls play. I think that they have a lot of fun players that I enjoy watching. And, I think Billy Donovan's a solid coach in this league. But to be honest, they're going to not be that good next year. And I'm under the assumption that Lonzo Ball is not playing. Now, could they completely shake things up, move off of Vucevic, make a whole bunch of moves that I'm not projecting? 100% they could. Arturas Karnisovas has already done that once to me, where he went out and made a flurry of moves where he brought in Lonzo, brought in DeRozan to kind of surround and add to his current pieces. Of course, you think back to that offseason too. He brought in a guy like Alex Caruso too. I think he had a phenomenal offseason. It just hasn't panned out as well as I think a lot of people would have expected. I myself said that the Bulls were potential long-term losers because of that offseason. And I said, look, I think every single individual signing is good. I just was worried about the long-term upside and kind of the amount of assets that they had committed to something like this. And I think that's starting to rear its ugly head here a little bit because the long-term outlook and the short-term outlook for Chicago, I think, is not great and really not great. The short-term outlook, they're going to be competitive. As long as you have DeRozan and LaVine, you're going to be a pretty decent team. You're going to win some games. But are you going to win a playoff series? The answer to that's probably no, which is why the short-term outlook's like only decent. And then the long-term outlook is, Vucevic is almost 33. DeRozan's into his 30s. Zach LaVine has multiple knee injuries. Lonzo Ball, and this is the biggest issue. Lonzo Ball, if he's healthy, I feel just so much better about the team, and I feel like they're going to be so much more competitive because he's a lot of the missing elements that they need. But I can't count on him being on the floor at this point. So because of that, I'm kind of out on the future on this franchise. And if I were running the show, I would blow it up. I haven't really talked about what I would do very much in a lot of these other offseason previews. I think for Chicago, it's been very important for me to mention my thoughts. And I'm not going to lie and say everything's sunshine and rainbows right now in Chicago. It shouldn't be. And I think that at some point, some people might get fired for how all of this plays out, because I think Chicago probably goes through this entire DeRozan era without winning a playoff series. Who knows if they'll even make it to another postseason series. They haven't since last year, of course, missing the playoffs this year. That's not really fair for them, but it's just the reality. And I think this Bulls team, with the injuries that they've sustained and some of the guys that they have had out and some of the guys that they've had on the roster, it's just, there's some flaws. And I just can't buy into it. I really can't. I don't like the outlook of this franchise. And for me, again, if I was running the show, I'd explore trading LaVine, and then I would explore trading or seeing if I could pull off a sign and trade, that is, for Nikola Vucevic. And then I would see what I can do maybe with DeRozan if I get good value for him or not. I wouldn't mind keeping DeRozan. It kind of looks like a guy who's going to sell some tickets for me. Although I just don't think he's going to win you that many games himself individually. That's okay. Because I think if the Bulls were to move off LaVine and Vucevic and kind of sell moves, you maybe start to focus the development fully on Patrick Williams, really just put the ball in his hands, hope something happens like what we've seen with Mikal Bridges in Brooklyn. I don't expect that to happen, though. I think Patrick Williams is a worse player than Mikal Bridges, but maybe you can inflate some of those numbers a little bit and kind of create a perception around the league that sometimes he'll go off for 30 points and everyone's going to say, whoa, what's Patrick Williams doing in Chicago? And then you just need one suitor to trade him to and just kind of reset the entire table, which is what I think Chicago needs to do. But again, I don't expect them to do that because it would require their decision makers to say, hey, we were wrong and we need to fix this, which I'm just not expecting them to do because a lot of decision makers in the NBA don't have the guts to actually do that and say, I made a mistake. So that's really, I think, where the Bulls are at. I'm sorry, Bulls fans. I wish I was higher on the future of this franchise. I'm just really not at this point. I'm glad that they went for it. I just don't know if they fully made all the right moves to go for it. And because of that, I have some long-term concerns. But for the most part, they're going to at least be fun to watch if they do keep this core together. Thank you all so much for watching. If you did enjoy today's video, make sure to leave a like. subscribe to the channel for more. This has been another utility sports video. Again, smash that like button, subscribe, and then also leave a notification or leave a comment down below, excuse me, if you'd like to see a different team. Thanks again so much for watching, and we'll catch you in the very next utility sports video.